Hey, what is up guys? Hopefully you guys are excited for today's video. It actually has been some time since I covered the events of 9/11, and I think it's a good chance as any to make a video about the conspiracies about 9/11. So we'll go over the many conspiracies and go over them and try to disprove them with the information that we have based on multiple sources. So without further ado, let's get right on in. But before we kind of continue on, I actually want to go over why the theories started to rise over the period of time. So it would be around 2004 to 2005 where mainstream media coverage would actually start to increase the amount of stories and news that they would spread, which would lead to the 24-hour news cycle. And that would lead to the spread of theories revolving around 9/11 as time went on. So in an attempt to address the growing publicity of the theories, the State Department would actually create a website with the most known conspiracies so that they would use it to debunk them, which I'll go over as we continue. The National Security Strategy paper would claim that terrorism sprang from, quote, subcultures of conspiracies and misinformation, and that, quote, terrorists have more effectiveness in recruitment from populations whose information about the world is contaminated by falsehoods and corrupted by conspiracy theories. The distortion keeps alive grievances and filters out facts that would challenge popular prejudices and serve self-serving propaganda. And personally, I don't think that that's just it, as additionally, I feel like it also comes with the passage of time as people tend to forget details about the events, and there is a growing increase in those who grew up after, where they weren't properly taught about the events and what exactly happened, which would lead to the mainstream, spreading more conspiracy theories and stuff like that, which would, grow over time. And that would actually range in three different categories, with those being the ones who let it happen on purpose, the ones who made it happen on purpose, and the ones that reject any accepted account. With the first suggesting that certain key individuals within the government had some foreknowledge of the attacks and deliberately ignored it so that it would weaken the US defense and ensure that hijacked planes were not intercepted. And the second is that, again, key individuals within the government planned the attacks and either worked with or framed Al-Qaeda in carrying it out. And the third is basically the general idea that it's not a specific theory, but more that the US's account is wrong and that they would like it to be reinvestigated. So it seems personally to me is that a good chunk of these theories revolve around the claim that the inaction or action, depending on how you view it, leads to the development of these theories. And in my previous video, you can kind of understand why people are more susceptible to that idea or more likely to believe it in some of these theories. Because it's not completely a lie. They did have a ton of information, and it was more due to a small, quote unquote, well, let's call it rivalry between the CIA and the FBI, where there was a lack of policy to allow them to use certain information or to send them certain information in detaining some of the members, and to a degree of some incompetence or human error. So in the mind of someone looking at this, you can see why one could deduce that because X agency did not pass this info or notify those higher up, one could actually have the belief that this was done on purpose. So now that we kind of set that reminder, we can go off on the list of theories and see how they have been debunked. The first theory happened 6 months after the attack, and that is the belief that the attack on the Pentagon was hit by a missile launched by someone from inside the US government, and that was being pushed by French conspiracy theorist Thierry Mason, with him claiming that a cruise missile with a depleted uranium warhead struck the Pentagon. The only issue out of many is that this conspiracy is that Thierry tends to dismiss the multiple eyewitnesses that saw the plane crash, alongside the fact that he never went to the US to conduct research or interviews of those who were at that very site. They would find passengers and crew members that they managed to recover, with them finding 184 out of the 189, with reports and photographs that showed the plane debris at the crash site, such as a nose cone, landing gear, the fuselage, and an intact cockpit, among a few other things. Or even the phone recordings that were made on Flight 77, with them reporting on the hijacking, along with the black boxes that had the recordings of the cockpit and the flight data recorder. And the fact that multiple Al-Qaeda leaders admitted to the attacks, like Bin Laden, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and Ramzi bin al-Shibh, where Khalid being interviewed where he would say, quote, "I am the head of the Al-Qaeda military committee, and Ramzi is the coordinator of the Holy Tuesday operation. And yes, we did it." Thankfully, to at least those who believe in the evidence, the book that he made with these claims was heavily criticized by the French press the moment it came out, with one of the news publications, The Liberation, referring to the book as, quote, "a frightening confidence trick, a tissue of wild and irresponsible allegations entirely without foundation," end quote. And in the website, they actually do show a list of a lot of the people who were actually witness to it, which I will show on screen. Now, that isn't the only book that were made about 9/11, as there was another individual by the name of Klaus von Burlow, who would actually make the claim that they orchestrated the attack as a way to increase support for the war in Iraq. And at least at the time of the theories, they were only popular in Europe, with them being dismissed and claimed as products of anti-Americanism, with George W. Bush also denouncing the emergence of outrageous conspiracy theories that attempted to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves, away from the guilty. And a surprise to me was that the majority of the early conspiracy theories were actually pushed by the left, as both Thierry and von Berlo were either social democrats or socialist leaning. Insider trading theory. Next on the list is the insider trading theory, in which some theories have the belief that just before the events of 9/11, a quote, extraordinary amount of put options in place of United Airlines and American Airlines stocks, which for those who don't know what a put option is where if a stock drops at a certain point, it automatically sells it, with them making the claim that insiders might have known in advance of what was about to come. With a study from the Journal of Business back in 2006 bringing up how there is evidence of unusual put option market activity in the days leading up to the attack, with its intent being addressed to the quote, a great deal of speculation about whether put option market activity indicated that the terrorists and their associates had traded in the days leading up to 9/11 on advanced knowledge of the impending attacks. And this was all covered by the 9/11 Commission, with them finding that, quote, although some unusual and initially seemingly suspicious trading activity did occur on the days prior to September 11th, it was all coincidentally innocuous and not the result of insider trading by parties with foreknowledge of the attacks. With this also being included, a single US-based institutional investor with no conceivable ties to Al-Qaeda purchased 95% of the UAL on September 6th as part of a trading strategy that also included buying 150,000 shares of American on September 10th. Similarly, much of the seemingly suspicious trading in America on September 10th was traced to a specific US-based option trading newsletter, faxed to its subscribers on Sunday, September 9th, which recommended these trades. The second FBI, aided by other agencies and security industries, devoted enormous resources to investigate this issue, including securing the cooperation of many foreign governments. These investigators have found that the apparently suspicious constantly proved innocuous. So just to kind of wrap it all up into something short, is that they mostly found that it was coming from a newsletter basically recommending to do a put option. So nothing too crazy. The ADS, also known as the Air Defense Stand Down Theory, is the belief that the North American Aerospace Defense Command issued a stand down order or deliberately scrambled fighters late to allow the hijacked planes to reach their targets without interference. They suggested NORAD had the capacity to locate and intercept planes on 9/11, and that its failures to do so indicated a conspiracy within the government to allow the attacks to occur. Now, the issue with this one is more of the lack of understanding of how things work, such as procedures and an awareness of the technology of the time and how these events played out. Like how one of the first things the hijackers did was turn off or disable the transponders of each of their aircrafts. And because they turned off the transponder, the signal that they used to identify the aircraft's tail number, altitude, and speed, these planes would actually appear as blimps among 4.5 thousand other blimps on NORAD's radar screen, which would make it difficult for them to even track. And on 9/11, there would actually only be 14 fighter jets on alert in the US, with no method for civilian air traffic control to get into contact with NORAD to alert them. And because the last plane hijacking that happened in the US happened in 1979, it wasn't expected, and it actually made it difficult, with Major Douglas Martin, a public affairs officer for NORAD, saying they had to pick up the phone and literally dial us, with only one plane ever being intercepted by NORAD prior to 9/11, to demonstrate how unprecedented it was for them with everything happening. And there would also be a rule in effect at the time where they would bar supersonic flights on interceptions, with all other interceptions being limited to offshore air defense identification zones, with them not even having any domestic ADIZ. And as I said before, technology and a lack of procedure led to a delayed response, as NORAD wasn't alerted by the FAA until right after the second plane, Flight 175, crashed into the second tower, with the FAA also notifying NORAD of a missing Flight 77 3 minutes before it struck the Pentagon. And in terms of Flight 93, Major General Larry Arnold indicated that there had been time to intercept the plane, but that they were waiting for authorization to shoot it down, something they wouldn't need to do, as the passengers on the flight would actually cause the plane to crash while trying to take over the cockpit. And this theory truly shows how much failings led to the events of 9/11, but I don't think it's the fault of the ones at the FAA or even NORAD. It genuinely feels like a failing of policy, structure, communication, and just the plain fact that this had just never happened before, and that we need to remind ourselves that those that work in these agencies are just like you and me. And if something were to happen like this again, I certainly don't think I could do as good of a job as them when it comes to how they handle the situation. And that those that tend to push theories like this tend to dismiss that, the fact that there's human error to it. But, with that being said, let's move on. So there's actually a claim that Israeli agents may have had some foreknowledge of the attack, and that a persistent theory claimed that Israel or Jewish people were involved. Like how 4 hours after the attack, the FBI would arrest 5 Israelis who had been filming the smoking skyline from the roof of a white van in a parking lot of an apartment building for, quote, puzzling behavior. With these Israeli men videotaping everything that was happening, with a bystander saying that they acted in a suspicious manner, with him saying, quote, they were like happy, They didn't look shocked to me. I thought it was very strange, end quote. The van that they were on top of would actually be found to be owned by an Israeli-owned company called Urban Moving, with the FBI believing that it was providing cover for an Israeli intelligence operation, with the case then being moved to the FBI's Foreign Counterintelligence Section. And according to a former CIA operations chief, he would say, quote, many people in the US intelligence community believe that some of the men arrested were working for Israeli intelligence, with a spokesperson for the Israeli Embassy of the United States saying that men had not been involved of any intelligence operations in the US, and with the FBI eventually concluding that the 5 Israelis probably had no foreknowledge of the attacks. Which is kind of strange because, at least from what I've been looking through, there is no interview with them, so there's no answer we can get from them. Maybe what the person who saw them, quote unquote smiling is probably not what he thought, and since they're Israeli, I'm guessing they're speaking Yiddish or whatever the Jews' language is, the Jewanese, but that's what I'm guessing. They were more in awe, not awe. What would be the word? They were shocked at what was happening. I don't know what to say. They were looking at it. They were probably like, oh my God, what is happening? And it maybe came across to the guys they look too happy, This theory is one of the more well-known theories, where the belief is that the World Trading Center collapsed wasn't solely caused by the airliners crashing or by the fire damage, but because explosives were installed in the building way in advance. As early advocates of the theory, from physicist Stephen E. Jones, architect Richard Gage, software engineer Jim Hoffman, and theologian David Ray Griffin, proposed that the aircraft's impact and resulting fires themselves couldn't have weakened the building sufficiently to initiate the collapse, and that the building had neither collapsed completely nor at the speed that they did without additional energy involved in the weakness of the structure. With the National Institute of Standards and Technology and the magazine Popular Mechanics examining and rejecting these theories, with even specialists in structural mechanics and structural engineering accepting the model of a fire-induced gravity-driven collapse of the World Trade Center building, an explanation that did not involve the use of explosives. And I will read some of the PDF. So if you want, you can read the rest of the PDF, but I'm only going to read certain sections of what they were able to find as the potential causes of the collapse. Obviously, you can read the rest. I'll probably put it in the description if it's, requested. But yeah, I'll just read it, but it's really wordy. So it would say, although the structural damage indicated by aircraft was severe, it was only local without stripping of a significant portion of the steel insulation during impact. The subsequent fire would likely not have led to an overall collapse, as generally accepted by the community of specialists in structural mechanics and structural engineering. The failure scenario was as follows. About 60% of the 60 columns in the impacted face of framed tube were severed, and many more were significantly defected. This caused stress redistribution, which significantly increased the load of some columns, attaining or near the load capacity of some of them. Because a significant of steel insulation was stripped, many steel structure members heated up to 600 degrees Celsius. As confirmed by annealing studies of steel debris, the structural steel used losses about 20% of its yield strength already at 300 degrees Celsius and about 85% at 600 degrees, and exhibit significantly vioplasticity or creep above 450 Celsius. Especially in the columns overstressed due to load redistribution, the press reports right after September 11, 2001, indicating temperatures in excess of 800 degrees Celsius, turned out to be groundless. But Bazant's and Zhu's analysis did not depend on that. Differential thermal expansion combined with heat-induced vioplasticity deformation caused the floor trusses to sag. The catenary action of sagging trusses pulled many parameter columns inward. The bowing of these columns served as a huge imperfection, inducing multi-story out-of-plane buckling of framing tube walls. The lateral deflection of some of these columns due to aircraft impact, the differential thermal expansion, and overstress due to load redistribution also diminished buckling strength. The combination of 7 effects: 1. Overstress of the columns due to initial load redistribution. 2. Overheating due to loss of steel insulation. 3. Drastic lowering of yield limited and creep threshold by heat. 4. Lateral deflection of many columns due to thermal strain and sagging floor trusses. 5. Weakened lateral support due to reduced in-plane stiffness of sagging floor. 6. Multi-story bowing of some columns. And 7. Local plastic buckling of heat column webs, finally leading to buckling of columns. As a result, the upper part of the tower fell, with little resistance, though at least one floor height impacted the lower part of the tower. This triggered progressive collapse because of kinetic energy of the falling upper part exceeding, by order of the magnitude, the energy that could be absorbed by limited plastic deformations and fracturing in the lower part of the tower. So the NIST found, quote, no corresponding evidence of alternating hypothesis suggesting that the World Trade Center towers were brought down by controlled demolitions using explosive planted prior to September 11, 2001, with multiple experts also having dismissed the controlled demolition conspiracy theory. And in 2006, Jones would actually suggest that thermite and super thermite might have been used by government insiders with access to such materials and at the buildings themselves to demolish the buildings. And in 2006, Jones would suggest that thermite or super thermite may have been used by the government insiders with access to such materials and to the buildings themselves to demolish the buildings. With Jones, Daniel Neil H. Harrod, and 7 other authors publishing a paper in the Open Chemical Physics Journal at around April 2009, causing the editor, Professor Marie-Paul Piliani, I don't know, to resign as she accused the publishers of printing it without her knowledge. The article being titled Active Thermite Material Discovered at Dust in the 9/11 World Trade Center Catastrophe, where they would actually state where they had found the evidence of nanothermite in samples of the dust that was produced during the collapse of the towers. NIST would actually respond that there was no, quote, clear chain of custody, end quote, to prove that the 4 samples of dust came from the World Trade Center site, and Jones invited NIST to conduct its own studies using its own known, quote, chain of custody dust, but the NIST did not investigate. Which, depending on whose side you're on, it could look fishy that they didn't respond, but I will explain later as to the kind of things that might answer for what they found. But yeah, like I said, it might look weird just because you're like, okay, why don't you look at what they have, what they provided? But I'm guessing the only reason why they didn't is because it's not really easy to prove that he managed to get it from the collapse of the towers without, going through a process or showing that he collected it at the site. And like I said, there will be evidence that you'll be able to look at that kind of shows where he may have gotten it or how he even came to suspect that it might have thermite in it. At least that's how it would initially looking, but it would also seem that Jones may have removed certain findings in order to fit his theory. And I'm stating that mostly due to the fact that other professors have said as much, providing context as to why Jones may have built up the belief of the explosives. With Northwestern University professor of civil engineering Zdeněk Baznet, who was one of the first to offer a published peer-reviewed theory of the collapse, where he wrote, quote, a few outsiders claiming a conspiracy with planted explosives. With Northwestern University professor of civil engineering Zdeněk Baznet, who was one of the first to actually offer a published peer-reviewed theory of the collapse, where he wrote, quote, a few outsiders are claiming a conspiracy with planted explosives, end quote. As an exception, Baznet and Verder would actually trace such, quote, strange ideas to another, quote, mistaken impression that safety margins in design would make the collapse impossible. One of the effects of a more detailed modeling of the progressive collapse, which they could say came to a, quote, dispel the myth of planted explosives, which again, in the PDF, they are actually they're one of the people that did the research, so they have the credentials to kind of prove that he may have been wrong. Baznet and Verder would actually propose to examine the data from a controlled demolition in order to better model the progressive collapse of the tower, suggesting that progressive collapse and controlled demolition are not two separate models of failure, as the controlled demolition conspiracy theory assumed initially. With Thomas Edgar, a professor of material science and engineering at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, would also dismiss the controlled demolition conspiracy theory, with Edgar remarking, quote, these people in the 9/11 truth movement use the reverse scientific method, determine what happened, throw out all the data that doesn't fit in their conclusion, and then hail their findings as the only possible conclusion, end quote. Which isn't new or isn't surprising if you've seen some of my conspiracy theory videos or watch any kind of conspiracy in general, where they tend to do that a lot. They like to dismiss a lot of evidence in order to fit the narrative that they're trying to convey. So yeah. So regarding Jones's theory that nanothermite was used to bring down the towers, and the assertion that thermite and nanothermite composites were found in the dust and debris were found following the collapse of the 3 buildings, which would be considered to be evidence by them that explosives brought down the buildings. With Brent Blanchard, author of A History of Explosive Demolition in America, would state that the questions about the validity of Jones's theory remain unanswered, such as the fact that 1. No demolition personnel noticed any signs of thermite during the 8 months of debris removal following the tower's collapse. And that Blanchard also stated that a verifiable chain of possessions needs to be established for the tested beams, which did not occur with the beams Jones tested, which for those who don't know, they need to go through a process of being verified, such as finding the location, the substance, etc., until it could actually be used as verified evidence, which would then put into question whether the metal pieces tested would actually been cut away from debris piles with acetylene torches, shears, and other potentially contaminated equipment while on site, or even exposed to trace amounts of thermite or other compounds while being handled, while in storage, or while being transferred to ground zero to memorial sites. With Damon Thomas of Skeptical Inquirer magazine noted that the residue in question was claimed to be thermitic because of its iron oxide and aluminum composition, pointed out that these substances were found in many items common to the tower, and that in order to cut through a vertical steel beam, special high temperature contaminants must be added to prevent the molten iron from dropping down, and that the thermite reaction is too slow for it to be practically used in building demolition. Thomas also pointed out that when Jesse Ventura, who was a former governor and ex-wrestler, which makes a lot of sense if he's, a conspiracy theorist, just for reasons, where he hired Mexico Tech to conduct a demonstration showing nanothermite slicing through a large steel beam, with the nanothermite producing copious flames and smoke, but no damage to the beam, even though it was in a horizontal, therefore optimal position. So now that you reach the end of this one, where this one was actually very popular with the whole meme of jet fuel can't melt steel beams, and technically no, but the fact that nobody really thinks of the fact that the insulation was removed from the beams, that there was high temperatures, that the structure was already damaged to a high point, and that the beams that were already still standing were already at the expected holding position? No, not holding. It was at its structural limit, okay, and it would have fell. So the fact that people created this whole fucking theory around bombs causing everything to fall down is just crazy stupid. And the fact, if you continue to believe this, then all I gotta say is, at least to me, you're kind of dumb. So just please do us all a favor and just go to the corner. So there is one conspiracy theory surrounding the events that claim that Flight 93, the one that crashed, was actually shot down by US fighter jets, with promoters of this theory such as David Ray Griffin and Alex Jones having asserted that a large part of the plane, including the main body of the engine, landed miles away from the main wreckage site, which was too far away for an ordinary plane wreckage, with Jones saying that planes usually leave small debris fields when they crash, and that this is not comparable with reports of wreckages found further away from the main crash site, with one person making the claim that the engine was found miles away from the main wreckage, and that the damage was comparable to that of a heat-seeking missile, and the damage that would do to an airliner, with some of the theories suggesting that the plane had to be shot down by the government because passengers had found out about the plot, which is kind of stupid. I don't know, whatever. I hope they do realize that there's phones that they used to call people, and that if they found out about the plot, they would just tell the people that they were calling, yo, the US is gonna hit us, hello. I don't know, it's just stupid. The fact that there are reports of them calling loved ones and stuff, you don't think they would have brought up the fact that they were gonna get shot down by the US government, and they would have told their family members that was happening? I don't know. Phil Mollet of the Skeptics magazine would go on to say that, quote, "This claim rests largely on an unsupported assertion that the main body of the engine and other large parts of the plane turned up miles from the main wreckage site, too far away to have resulted from an ordinary crash. This claim is incorrect because the engine was found only 300 yards from the main crash site, and its location was consistent with the direction of which the plane had been traveling." End quote. Michael K. Haynes, an airline accident expert who investigated the crash of Flight 800 in 1996, said that at a very high velocity of 500 miles per hour or more, it would actually take a few seconds to move or tumble across the ground for 300 yards. And the reports of wreckage pieces discovered at Indian Lake by local residents are accurate, with CNN reporting that investigators found debris from the crash site at least 8 miles away from the crash site, including in New Baltimore, but that the debris was all very light material that the wind would easily have blown away. With the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette posting an article from September 14th, 2001, describing the material as, quote, mostly paper, strands of charred insulation, and an endorsed paycheck. The same article would quote Bill Crowley, where he would say, lighter, smaller debris probably shot into the air on the heat of a fireball. The witnesses said shot several hundred feet into the air after the jetliner crashed. Then, it probably rode a wind that was blowing southeast at about 9 miles per hour. End quote. And the distance between the crash site and Indian Lake might have been misreported in some accounts, with the BBC saying, quote, in a straight line, Indian Lake is just over a mile from the crash site. The road between the two locations takes a roundabout route of 6.9 miles, accounting for the erroneous reports. Some internet videos, such as Loose Change, would speculate that Flight 93 safely landed in Ohio and a substitute plane was involved in the crash in Pennsylvania. It would often be cited as a preliminary news report that Flight 93 landed in Cleveland Airport, and it was later learned that Delta Flight 1989 was the plane confused with Flight 93, and that the report would be retracted as inaccurate. Several websites within the 9/11 Truth Movement, which for those who don't know is an organization where individuals question whether the US government, agencies, or individuals within the agencies were either responsible for or purposely complicit in the attacks. That's what they are. But they would dispute this claim, citing the wreckage at the scene, eyewitness testimonies, and the difficulty of secretly substituting one plane for another, and the claim that such, quote, hoax theories appear circulating to alienate victim survivors and the large public of the 9/11 Truth Movement. With the editor of the article had since written a rebuttal to those claims, which you can actually read. And what's crazy is that Valencia McCatchley, a local woman who took the only photo of the mushroom cloud from the impact of Flight 93 just seconds after it hit the ground, was said to have been harassed over the phone and in person by conspiracy theorists who claim she actually faked the photo. The FBI, Somerset County, the Smithsonian, and the National Park Service's Flight 93 National Memorial staff have all separately examined the photograph as well as the film's negatives, and all 4 agencies consider the photos to be 100% authentic. So they can just suck it. This theory would actually be after the attacks, where the BBC would actually publish the names and identities of what they believe to be the hijackers, with some of the people named later to be discovered to be alive, which would be picked up by the 9/11 conspiracy theories as proofs that the hijackings were fake. The BBC would explain that the initial confusion may have arisen because the names that they reported back in 2001 were common Arabic and Islamic names, which is not too crazy because I had a friend who was named Muhammad, and he knew someone that was named Muhammad, so it's not too far-fetched to get some names that look the same. And in a response to a request from the BBC, the FBI said that it was confident to have identified all 19 hijackers and that none of the other inquiries had risen the issue of doubt about the identities. And the New York Times would also acknowledge that this would also be a case of mistaken identity. John Bradley, a former managing editor of Arab News in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, would actually go on to say that the only other public information about the hijackers was a list of names issued by the FBI on September 14th, 2001. And when the FBI released the photographs 4 days after the reporting on September 27th, the mistaken identities were quickly resolved. So it kind of shut them up real quick once they saw pictures with the names. And according to Thomas Keane, chair of the 9/11 Commission, would say that, quote, 16 of the 19 shouldn't have gotten into the United States in a way at all because there was something wrong with their visas, something wrong with their passports. They should simply have been stopped at the border. That was 16 of the 19. Obviously, even half of these people have been stopped, they never would have been a plot. And as I stated in my last video, Khalid al-Midhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi had both been identified as al-Qaeda agents by the CIA, but again that information was not shared with the FBI or US immigration, so both men were actually able to enter illegally to the US to prepare for the 9/11 attack. And I know I stated it before, but it's still upsetting that information as critical as this wasn't being shared within the agencies. The no planes theory would actually come from a former chief economist within the Labor Department under the Bush administration by the name of Morgan Reynolds, who argues that no planes were used in the attacks, with him claiming that it's physically impossible that a Boeing plane of Flight 11 and 175 could have penetrated the steel frames of the towers, which again, that goes into the steel beam theory, and that a digital composition was used to depict the planes crashing in both news reports and subsequent amateur videos. Quote, "There were no planes, there were no hijackers," Reynolds would insist. I know, I'm out of the mainstream, but that's the way it is, end quote. Bro, just shut up and put the fucking money in the bag, bro. Fucking dumbass. David Shaylar, a former British MI5 and a conspiracy theorist, would go on to say, quote, "The only explanation was that there were missiles surrounded by holograms made it to look like planes. Watch footage frame by frame and you will see a cigar-shaped missile hitting the World Trade Center." Most no-plane theorists, including Thierry Mason and Reynolds, would assert that either CGI of a plane was overlaid with a winged cruise missile or military aircraft, or that computer-generated images of a passenger plane were inserted into the video footage and a plane-shaped explosive cut out were planted in the building in order to create an impression of a plane impact. That's a fucking mouthful, Jesus. Which, I don't know, personally this one seems like so much work, and it's to the point where if you were open to listening to theories about 9/11, you would probably look at this one more funnier than the other ones, because this one seems more tinfoil hatty than the other ones. And strangely, some truth movement veterans would actually repeatedly refuse the no plane claims, with certain discussions of no plane theories being banned from certain conspiracy theories websites, with advocates having sometimes been threatened with violence by posters at other conspiracy theories websites, which I think that just kind of proves my point that this one seems so far-fetched, so out there that no one would believe that, not even the dumbest of conspiracy theorists, or at least dumbest in the terms of like the ones who try to put a sprinkle of logic into their theory. And up until the mid-1970s, the use of asbestos for fireproofing was widespread in construction industry, but in April 1970, the New York City Department of Air Resources ordered contractors building the World Trade Center to stop the spraying of asbestos as an insulating material as vermiculite. Let me see how that's spelled.
Vermiculite.
But yes, they would use vermiculite plaster, which would be used instead. And after the 93 bombing, inspections found fireproofing to be deficient, and before the collapse, the tower owners, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, was actually in the process of adding fireproofing, and it actually had completed but only about 18 floors of the World Trade Center, at least in terms of the first tower, including all the floors affected by the aircraft impact and fires, and only 13 floors in the second tower, although none were directly affected by the aircraft's impact. And so we reached the end. Now there might be more theories out there, but at least from the ones that I could find, these are the more prominent ones. So there might be more obscure ones, but I'm not going to bother doing that because this one was a large project, so I think we can all be content with what I brought to the table, okay? But yes, a lot of these theories I didn't know about. Some of them are really dumb. Some of them are crazy. Some of them you could probably look at it and be like, okay, I give props to them for thinking of the theory. But again, once you tend to dismiss certain evidence, as I stated before, you kind of start, losing the plot a little bit. I'm just saying, like, if you tend to dismiss certain things that you don't want to hear, then I'm sorry, you're kind of stupid. But yeah, I want to know your thoughts, see if any of them kind of piqued your interest. Who knows, maybe you'll go into the rabbit hole of becoming a theorist. But I don't know, I found these interesting. They're not entertaining per se because of how much people die, but I guess it was fascinating to learn about. Now that we covered the jet fuel can't melt steel beams, I guess I won't be saying it anymore, because at least in this context, it kind of did. In a way, I've explained it before, but kind of did. But in terms of the next project, it is going to be about a person, as I've done a couple of times in my channel, so you can look forward to that. In terms of gaming, the next one is, funny enough, about Tung 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 Sahur chasing me, I think. I don't know, I've only seen like the page of the game, so I guess we'll find out how good it is. and after that I bought like a bunch of horror games, so I'll get to them eventually. But yeah, hopefully you guys are looking forward to that. If you like the video, let me know. If you don't, I don't know what to tell you. But yeah, subscribe, like, all that stuff. Yeah, I'll see you in the next one. So I hope you guys have a good morning, a good afternoon, and a good night. Until next time, you guys take care. Yeah.